بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبا القاسم محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين لا سيما بقية الله روحي وأرواح العالمين لتراب مقدمه الفداء. ما بعد, respected scholars, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, to recap from yesterday night's topic, again sending our heartfelt condolences to our Imam Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman on the tragic commemoration of the martyrdom, of the second occasion of the martyrdom of Fatima al-Zahra, the greatest lady to ever walk this earth. We started yesterday's topic by looking at a specific aspect in Islamic history where we tried to analyze where the downfall of the Islamic, let's say, empire, we stated yesterday, began. Where did it start that people started to differ from the path that Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet of Islam came to instill? In order that we can see why is it that the Ahlul Bayt would be martyred in such a manner, would be prosecuted in such a manner, would be treated in such a manner that only short period of time after the Prophet of Islam's martyrdom that Fatima al-Zahra passes away in the manner that she does. Ali ibn Abi Talib is struck in the manner that he's struck, and the grandchildren and the sons, if we want to look at it, of the Prophet of Islam, one is poisoned, and one till today remains the greatest tragedy ever to occur that we know of. Now, in that case, yesterday we started off by looking at the differences, because some people said, and we stated yesterday, that Islam is still the same perfect message that it is, and no one has differed from the correct path. And yesterday we analyzed how much of a deviation there has been from the straight path, which the Prophet came to instill, and the message came to teach us. So much so that nowadays people would find themselves following someone that says that the earth is still flat, and anyone that disbelieves in that is looked at to be a kafir. Now, that leaves a lot to be questioned in a matter of what is being taught and what is Islamic and what's barbaric. Now, tonight we want to analyze three different events that occurred within history that we can relate, or people, especially historians, have related the downfall of Islam or the deviation that started of the Islamic State or the empire from. And we're going to look at these three incidents, inshallah, tonight with the limited time that we have. The first of which is the incident we mentioned yesterday, which was the calamity of Thursday. That's the first event we'll look at tonight. The second will be the idea and the concept of Saqifa. Not so much the biography of what's happened in Saqifa, inshallah, that's for a different time, but the effect that such an event had on history. And the third and final event we want to look at very briefly, if the time restrains us, otherwise we'll leave it for tomorrow, is the Shura that the second Khalifa put forth in order that it chooses a Khalifa after him. And how are these three events relating to the topic of Fatima al-Zahra? That's all we conclude for tonight. So please help me and bless this majlis to start off tonight's topic with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The concept of the calamity of Thursday is one that we need to look at in depth, more so, because we stated yesterday that every single prophet, 124,000 of the prophets that came, never once left a covenant behind to say that for the people after me, if you hold on to this, you will not go astray. And we said that the only person that came forth to say that was the Prophet of Islam in his final moments when he said, bring forth what we look at nowadays is a pen and paper, so that I may write for you that in which you hold on to, you will never go astray. Now a person comes and says and sees the Prophet going in and out of consciousness in accordance with their riwayat, and he says, when the Prophet says, bring me a pen and paper in order that I must write for you my will, he says the Prophet is delirious. He said, let's not look at it in an aspect of how disrespectful that was to the greatest creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rather, let's look at the aftermath of such an event. So a person comes, calls the Prophet delirious in his final moments whilst he's writing a will. And no one brings that up when relating to the ethics and morality of the second Khalifa. And therefore he stood between the Prophet of Islam and writing a will in which the Islamic empire will never go astray after him. The interesting factor is that exactly the same thing happened towards the first Khalifa. When we look at history, you find that the first Khalifa of Islam after the Prophet, historically speaking, was Abu Bakr. And when he, in his final moments, after the 2 years in Khilafah, in his final moments, the interesting thing was that even he himself was going in and out of consciousness. Like we said, the Prophet of Islam also was in and out of consciousness in accordance to their riwayat. When he asked for a will to be written, the second Khalifa states, no, he's delirious. Let's see what happens towards the first Khalifa, so that we can look at the differences in the balance and equilibrium which people put forth. The Prophet of Islam and a mere companion. When a Prophet goes in and out of consciousness and asks for a will to be written, they're calling him delirious. Let's look at the first Khalifa. He falls in and out of consciousness. What happens? As he's writing his will, they've brought him a pen and paper. He's writing his will. Uthman, which was right by his side, he's writing the will of Abu Bakr. While he's writing it, Abu Bakr goes into an unconscious state. Then he awakes. He looks at Uthman and says, where are we up to in the will? He says, you said in your final words that my next, or the next person after me, that will be Khalifa, and you went into unconsciousness. So I wrote Umar ibn al-Khattab to be after you. Look at the reply of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr goes and looks at him and he says, thank God you've written someone that will take charge after me. Why? He says, so that no one will fight amongst themselves to choose a Khalifa. Because you've written someone to take my place after me, you have now made safe the Islamic empire. You have now written in a matter of fact that what? You have saved the Islamic empire from corruption, from fitna, from going astray. That's the first Khalifa. The interesting thing is when the Prophet tries to do that and tries to appoint someone after him in his final moments, he's not allowed. He's stopped. He's called delirious. You see where the tilt in the balance is? That the Prophet's still alive in his last moments, and you find people have already started to fight amongst themselves for power. Because from the start of the message of Islam, the companions all knew. When the Quran first states that tell your nearest of kin of the message, from that moment where he instilled that Ali ibn Abi Talib will be the Khalifa after me, all the way during his message of 23 years, up until the incident of Ghadir, he was reiterating the fact that the person after me is none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. During his whole message. Therefore, they knew when he was about to write a will, he's not going to have anything astray towards those 23 years. And the next person that they shall follow, and it will be inscribed, is Ali ibn Abi Talib. Now, that was the first incident that people attribute towards the deviation and the sectary or sects that will be emerging after the Prophet of Islam. So that's the first incident that we can look at. The second happened a few days after. The first incident, calamity of Thursday. Let's note it down. The second is the idea and the event of Saqifa. Why Saqifa? And many people haven't been accustomed to the idea and what's happened within the area of Saqifa and the event of Saqifa, how it occurred. It's an interesting event that inshallah we can look at in more detail, hopefully in the Prophet's martyrdom, or if we have an event for that particular exploration, let's say, of such a devious event. So Saqifa occurred. Why? Because the Ansar, as a secret gathering, wanted to choose a Khalifa amongst themselves without telling the Muhajirun. 3 Muhajirun came, of them was Umar and Abu Bakr. They emerged from the Saqifa with everyone giving their bay'ah towards Abu Bakr. Now, not looking at the larger events that occurred within Saqifa, Abu Bakr emerged as the Khalifa, knowing very well the interesting faculty, the Prophet hasn't even been buried. The Prophet's still being washed. And they're choosing a person to lead. A person not from our books, from the opposing books, writes, he says the people began to go astray and leave the message of Islam. Look at these words. He says people began to leave the message of Islam 10 days after the Prophet's martyrdom. Because that's when Saqifa occurred. After Saqifa in 10 days, he says people started to go outside the Islamic empire, go against Islam altogether. Muslims left Islam. Why? Look at the interesting faculty. They found themselves, they said to themselves, well, if the Prophet of Islam, 23 years, he's installed one Khalifa. And we were there in Ghadir Khum, when the greatest of companions, when Ali ibn Abi Talib was chosen, went into the tent, and they gave their allegiance towards Ali. And they said, Bakhin bakhin laka ya Ali, asbahta mawlana, wa mawla kullu mu'minin wa mu'mina. They said, we were there when they gave their bay'ah, the greatest of companions, or the highest ranked. Now, after the Prophet has passed away, they have diverted. If the greatest companions have gone against the teachings of the Prophet, where does it leave us? So that's why the people saw that themselves that the Prophet has died. The greatest of companions have gone against the message altogether. Where does it leave us? And they returned back to their old ways, outside Islam altogether. And you find the wars, or hurub al-ridda as they call it in Arabic, the war started 10 days after Saqifa, fighting amongst themselves. And that's one of the aspects that we need to look at, because people try to paint this picture that everything was beautiful after the Prophet was murdered, let's say. And I was reading this book about people that came towards the school of thought of Ahl al-Bayt. One of them mentioned something. He says, I came towards the school of thought of Ahl al-Bayt when my friend passed away. He says, I was in another continent. Listen to this story. He says, I was in another continent. I heard my friend passed away. He says, he wasn't the dearest of friends, but he was close to me. We had a bit of a connection, me and him. And he says, because I found that he passed away, I made an effort to attend his funeral. I made an effort to go towards his washing of the body and his burial. He says, one thing struck me as I was in the plane going towards his burial. He says, I remember one of my friends telling me that the first and second Khalifas never attended the washing of the Prophet. And he says, I began to think amongst myself. He goes, I don't have this close friend. It's not as close to me as the companions were to Rasulullah. He says, but I'm making an effort to cross countries in order that I attend his funeral. He says, how close must these people have been if he was only a few miles away and they leave him in that state to choose a person to be in a position of power? He goes, that made a light bulb click within me. And I began to research the events, and every time I flipped a page over, it became more and more ugly as I went through history. And I realized the only path that I need to follow is that of Ahlul Bayt. The people that have been oppressed within the history books. The people that their names should be a beacon of light to the world, not just to the school of thought of, or the followers of Ahlul Bayt. These names, he said, that we should go out and tell the world about. He says, that's where I was intended to follow. And he became a Shia. Why? A follower of Ahlul Bayt. Why? He goes, because of an incident that I went to go towards my friend's funeral. Events of Saqifa. That's the second thing we want to stop at. And think to ourselves that how many people left the religion of Islam altogether when they saw the highest ranked companions leave the Prophet and his teachings and his wills and choose a person to lead them contrary to what the Prophet has chosen for them. Number two. Number three that we want to conclude with, inshallah, for tonight, and we can look into the aspects of Fatima al-Zahra's oppression tomorrow, is the Shura that's happened when the second Khalifa put together 6 people in a locked, let's say, house, only to emerge with a chosen Khalifa. When Muawiyah talks to one of his friends, he says to him, where do you think Islam began to deteriorate? Muawiyah himself, he says that I know that Islam's deteriorating. He says, where do you think that Islam began to deteriorate and deviate from the straight path? So he's thinking to himself, well, let me mention a few. He says, was it from Saqifa? This is Muawiyah saying. He says, it wasn't from Saqifa, I don't think. He says, what, the calamity of Thursday? He says, no, it wasn't. Was it Ghadir Khum? He says, no, it wasn't Ghadir Khum. Was it the treaty between you and Al-Hasan? Alayhi afdal as-salati was-salam. He says, no, it wasn't. He says, where do you think, O Muawiyah, it began to deviate in an extended manner from the true path? Muawiyah looks at him and he says, the Shura that Umar put amongst 6. He says, but the first Khalifa was already chosen. The second Khalifa was already chosen. Why is it that when it comes to the third Khalifa that it begins to deviate in that extent? Look at the words of Muawiyah. He says, it began to deviate because before that, no one knew, except for Ali ibn Abi Talib, in that 6 who the rest were. As in, people that never imagined themselves to be in a position of power now had a chance to be Khalifa. As in, Talha and Zubayr never thought in their wildest imagination they could be Khalifa. Abdul Rahman ibn al-Awf never thought he'd be Khalifa. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas didn't think he was going to be Khalifa. Uthman never thought he'd be Khalifa. The truthful Khalifa is the Khalifa chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's Ali ibn Abi Talib. So when Umar appointed 6 people, 5 of which never thought or dreamt about being in a position of power in their life, that's where it began to deviate, because now a person has a position he wants to be in. And they'll do anything to achieve that position. Even after that election, people will look towards them, follow their footsteps. Why? They could be the worst of people, worst of creation. But because they were elected, now they're looked upon to be beacons in the Islamic state or the Islamic empire. He says also, when it deviated, he says you have to remember what and how Uthman was chosen. As in, when we look at the historical aspects of what happened within those doors, they came out and said, Ali ibn Abi Talib is the best person amongst us to lead. Not a problem. They chose Ali. You know what they asked Ali ibn Abi Talib? He says, okay, you can be Khalifa on the 3 conditions. What's the conditions? You have to accept these 2. That you will rule based on the Quran, based on the teachings and the Sunnah of the Prophet of Islam, and the teachings and the Sunnah of the first and the second. You see where it lies? The deviation. Now, not only does the Prophet have a Sunnah, but also the first and second. They wouldn't mention the first and second if it was intertwined with that of the Prophet. As in, if the same teachings that the first and second had was that of the Prophet, they wouldn't say, would you have to rule by the Prophet and the first and the second. They would just say you have to teach by the Quran and the Prophet's Sunnah. But that clarifies that there was after the Prophet a Sunnah of a first and a Sunnah of the second. That didn't go hand in hand with that of the Prophets. So in that instance, Ali ibn Abi Talib replies by saying, no, this Khilafah, I will only govern by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet of Islam, not the Sunnah of the first and second. So they looked, okay, you don't want it, not a problem. Uthman gets up. He says, will you govern based on the Quran, the Sunnah of Rasulullah, and the first and second? He says, not a problem, put me in a position of power. And they began and left that room by giving the bay'ah to Uthman in that manner. See where the diversion began? See where it deviated from the true path? Not only now, until that instance, is there a Sunnah of the Prophet. There are Sunnah and teachings of a first, and the Sunnah and teachings of a second. That contradicts with that of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam in many aspects. So Muawiyah states to his companion, he says, that's where I believe Islam deviated the most. But all in all, we can look at all these and find it's a domino effect. One made the second and third greater and greater. And that's why when we look at the tragedies of Karbala, we find ourselves thinking and linking the Saqifa, the events of Saqifa, and the oppression of Fatima al-Zahra with the killing of Imam Hussein. And we make the link that the same killers that killed Fatima al-Zahra were the same killers that killed Hussein. The same ribs that were broken behind the door were broken in Karbala. An infant there, an infant here. A door burnt, a tent burnt. And that's why in the 21st century we need to learn to be and to hold forth the straight path of Ahlul Bayt and not deviate. We need to question everything we do and where we gain our knowledge from in order that we do not divert from the correct path of Ahlul Bayt. Our actions speak louder than words. When we do and say as Ahlul Bayt teach us and tell us, rather than act in a manner which will please the killers of Ahlul Bayt, that's when we'll truly understand how to apply history to our lives in the 21st century. And inshallah tomorrow, after we've just looked at this particular aspect of the historical lineage of what's happened to Islam, in a very brief summary within these 20 minutes, tomorrow we want to look at, because of these events, how was it eligible for them, or opened up the idea that they could oppress the household of the greatest man ever to walk this earth. And inshallah we'll conclude on this note, brothers and sisters. And inshallah tomorrow we'll come back and look at Fatima al-Zahra's oppression and learn from it, and how we can remember Fatima al-Zahra on a daily perspective. But we pray to Allah on a conclusive note tonight that He allows us the knowledge to know right from wrong, allows us to gain the knowledge to differentiate in our everyday lives that path which Ahlul Bayt would take, and that path that goes contrary to Ahlul Bayt. And in order for us, and the tawfiq for us to choose that which is the right path. With the blessed Surah Al-Fatiha, but before it, three of your loudest salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.